Using a variety of textures can transform a room from flat to dynamic. Hi everyone, it's interior designer Carol Gilman. Let's discover interior design. In this video, we are going to talk about the design element of texture and how we can use that to create depth and a more dynamic space. First thing is, what is texture? Well, texture is one of the interior design elements. We have the design principles, which are guidelines for us on how to design a harmonious room. But we also have interior design elements like texture and color and line. Those are almost like the ingredients to a recipe to create a wonderful look and feel to a room. And texture is all about how things feel to us. It's tactile. And when we are thinking of fabric, for instance, we may say the hand of a fabric is smooth or bumpy. And when we are also talking about texture, it's not necessarily always just about how things are going to feel, because it can also be very visual, because we can pick up on visual clues on how something is going to feel, how a texture is going to look and feel. Or sometimes it can kind of deceive us. And if we see something that looks like it will feel a certain way, but then when we touch it, it's more decorative, that's a whole other thing and adds another dimension to texture. And we think of the psychology of color when we are designing a room, but texture is really important too on how things look and feel to us. When we have maybe really soft textures in a room, that may help us feel comfortable and cozy. So it's just as important as using color. And like other things in a room, if we have too much of something, a room can look and feel kind of flat. And so it's important when we are working with textures to use a variety of textures so that our room has depth and dimension. And we have a bunch of different types of textures to choose from. One way I like to think of texture is always in opposites. And so when we talk about different types of textures and how we want to bring in different types of textures into our rooms, one way to think about it is really just making sure that we have opposite textures in a room. So where we have rough and smooth textures and maybe matte and shiny textures. Just thinking about one texture and then thinking of the opposite texture will help us to remember to bring in both of those textures into a room. And many times when we refer to something that has maybe kind of a rougher texture to it, we just say that piece of furniture, that fabric has a texture to it. Well, I want to ask what type of texture. So just take some time to think about that the next time you look at something and see if you can describe it in what type of texture that it has. And most materials may have an inherent type of texture or quality of texture to them, but we can also manipulate those different materials so they have different types of texture. So for instance, say you're going to put a granite countertop on your countertops in your kitchen. Well, you have different types of textures or ways that they will polish that granite to create different types of texture. You can have a very polished granite look or a honed sort of finish, or maybe even what's called leathered or even flamed finish. And many times there are a family of textures that will be typical for a certain design style. So when we are trying to design a room or our home in a certain design style, along with colors or other types of elements, there will probably be certain textures that we would look to provide a look and feel that expresses that design style. So for instance, if you want to create an industrial sort of loft look, well, there are probably going to be textures that are maybe on the more coarse or rough side. Think of brick or maybe there's kind of unfinished metal or more rustic sort of elements. All of those different types of textures would remind us of maybe a more industrial style of look. And textures can provide a purely decorative look to a room, but sometimes textures are functional. So for instance, if you're looking for a flooring for your bathroom, maybe you're looking at tile or linoleum or vinyl, well, you may want to go towards a type of flooring that has a rougher texture to it so that there's some traction and so that the floor won't be super slippery. And if you want to find out more about texture, I created a video all about texture, so I'll leave a link to that video in this video's description. So when we want to help create a room that has depth and dimension to it, texture is really important. But how do we do that? So when we're thinking about texture, one thing that you can keep in mind is try to have maybe 4 different types of texture in a room. A group of 4 that you can think about using are rough and smooth or soft, and also matte and shiny. And if you'll notice, those are all opposite. So having both rougher and smoother, softer textures, as well as matte and shiny textures, helps to create variety in a room. And using opposite types of textures doesn't have to be extreme. Stay within that family that goes with the design style that you are going for, as well as just making some soft variations in between those different types of textures that will be comfortable and look and feel good to you. So when you're starting from the very beginning and designing a room from start to finish, keep those 4 different textures in mind that you want to incorporate in your room. And it's kind of a gradual layering process, starting out with those larger areas like your walls and floors. Those can provide the background texture to the room. Lots of times those may be in a more flatter or matte sort of style or texture. So for instance, maybe your walls are painted in an eggshell finish. Just a very soft, semi-matte, semi-smooth finish. And then your floors could be maybe a nice wood floor or a nice carpet. Something that is going to provide a nice background to the room. Then you come back in and add other layers and other elements in the room where you bring in other types of textures, thinking about those opposite types of textures. So when you start to bring in bigger pieces in the room, say a sofa in a living room or a bed in a bedroom, think about what would be the opposite type of texture compared to what you have going on with that design so far with the flooring and the walls. And how can you bring in an opposite style of texture on those bigger elements? So for instance, if you want to bring in a sofa into your living room, well, look to the walls and the floor. What is something you could do that would bring in another texture? Maybe that's something smoother, like a leather sofa. Anything that will create some contrast and add another layer of texture will help that room start to create some more depth. Then take a look at what you have so far with the background, the walls and the flooring and larger pieces of furniture and other elements in the room. Take a look at what may be missing, or maybe where you need a little bit more of one texture. That's where you can start to bring in another layer of textures, but maybe in smaller amounts, just so it adds some depth and dimension to the room. That's where we're thinking about accessories such as lamps or plants or any other type of smaller items in the room. And all along the way, from the start to the finish, you are paying attention to not only the colors and patterns and everything else that's going on in that room, but also to the textures and making sure that there's a balance between rough and smooth and soft and matte and shiny, and that there are varying degrees of this type of balance where the background and those larger pieces may have a more dominant texture to them. And then with smaller items like accessories, they may bring in just little accents of different types of textures, just so that there is a sense of balance and variety in the room. Each layer that you add adds more depth and dimension to the space. So to practice what we are talking about in this video, one thing I encourage you to do is take a moment in your busy week and assess one of your rooms. See if there is a room that may look and feel maybe a little flat and needs some depth, needs some variety in there to help it create a more dynamic space. Look and see if you are incorporating all 4 of those different textures. And if not, is there an opportunity somewhere in the room to either change things around, move things around, or to add something new that will bring in just a touch of a texture that you need in that room, and see if that will make a difference in how that room looks and feels. Share what you find out in the comments and let me know if you have any questions on this topic. Thanks so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Take care.